me. I'm Professor Lee Tiedrick. I have a dual appointment here in the law school in science and society. And to set the stage for our broader programming, one of the grand challenges, as we all learn about in our classes, is we have this technology with so many amazing potentials, both to advance social good, advance our economy, but if we don't use and manage it properly, there are also a lot of harms. So the focus is really, how can we as a society capitalize on the benefits of data and emerging technology and mitigate the risks? So we've been looking at this from a lot of different perspectives. And just by show of hands, how many of you celebrated Data Privacy Day this week? Yeah. So really, privacy is at the heart of these issues and this challenge. Simply put, we are not going to be able to capitalize on the benefits of data and technology unless we figure out how to safeguard individual privacy. So we thought that was a great topic for today's discussion, and I'm thrilled to be joined for today's discussion by my friend and former colleague, Jadzia Pierce, who is the Director of Global Privacy at Microsoft. And if you read the headlines, you'll know that privacy is a very busy area. And within Microsoft, and Jadzia will talk more about this, she helps the company manage their global privacy policies and data sharing, both across public policy spheres as well as within their internal organization, with the goal of making sure that the company and the broader community capitalizes on the benefits of the data, but does it in a very safe and trusted manner. So please join me in welcoming Jadzia here today. And I thought what we would do is start off for the students in the room. I mean, Jadzia, you've had such a diverse and meteoric career. Maybe you could share with us a little bit on your career journey, maybe starting off, graduating law school, and working in the nonprofit sector.
Sure. Yeah, so I've been really lucky, and I feel like from the get-go I found something that I liked and was passionate about, and that was privacy law, and decided to just go for it. So I didn't always start off that way. I actually started off wanting to be a journalist. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. I wanted to be based in the Middle East. I found myself in 2008 interning at the BBC in DC at the time when the Democratic Party was trying to choose their candidate for president between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. It was an incredible summer. I decided then that I didn't want to be a journalist, though. and it was because my mentor and friend at the BBC at the time, she was kind enough to take me to coffee, and I told her what I wanted. And I said I wanted, in-depth journalism coverage, and I wanted to interview everyone I met, and I wanted to bring context into the play. And she looked at me and she said, well, that's the way it's been. That's not how it's going to be for the most part anymore. Because in 2008, you'll recall, Facebook was just taking off, Twitter was just taking off, and this whole idea of citizen journalism was becoming a real thing. So to her credit, she immediately told me that if you want those long, in-depth pieces and reporting, and you could do that. But she said it's going to be much more of a struggle, so keep that in mind. As soon as she said that, I was fascinated by this idea of giving people technology to share information and to learn information at the exact same time. At the time, I was a little pie in the sky, and I thought it was the greatest thing for democracy that there's ever been. But then a few years later, I was working on the other side, doing PR, trying to figure out what I wanted to do next, and I saw that all my clients started to get breached. This was 2011, 2012. These were really the first major data breach incidents that came to the forefront and made people realize that there could be a lot of good in this, but there could also be significant harm, and no one had a handle on what to do about that yet. So I decided to go to law school, be a privacy lawyer. It was still a fairly new thing, but I just started searching for who is in this space, who is talking about these issues. And I found a group called the Center for Democracy and Technology, and they are a nonprofit tech policy group who had already been doing it for 20 or 30 years at that point. They had been at the beginning advocating for making sure that the internet works first and foremost for people. So I started reading their blog religiously. I had no connection to them whatsoever, and I didn't know how to make a connection with this group. But one day I got lucky. I was in DC. I went to an event. I asked a good question, I guess, and one of the panelists, she and I ended up chatting after the event, and I mentioned I was following CDT, and she said, well, I know some people there. If you're interested in applying for an internship after your first year, you know, definitely let me know. I'd be happy to see what I can do. And she did, and that's how I started off at CDT during what ended up being the summer of Snowden. So it was all lucky. It was just one thing led to another. I had a lot of awesome mentors who went out of their way for me and guided me, I guess, throughout the rest of the way.
But I think there's a couple really important teachable moments in what you just said. I mean, one, if you talk to people who've been out in the professional world for a long time, it's not uncommon and it's actually okay to start out on one career path, like in your case journalism, thinking that's what you want to do.
Yeah.
And I think another thing I heard from what you said is just talking to lots of people and learning about what the different opportunities are. And that's a really good way to inform your viewpoints on what you want to do. And I'm going to correct you on one thing. You called it luck. First of all, I worked with Jadzia at Covington. It wasn't luck. There's a lot of talent. But in addition, I think also being proactive, that you ran into Nancy at an event and you asked the questions, and not being fearful of reaching out to people and asking questions, because that's all a way of what you learn. So I think that even listening to this, there's a lot of really good lessons there for students in terms of how to figure out your career journey. And it's okay if sitting in these chairs today at Duke University, you don't know exactly what you want to do, because it takes a while to figure that out, and it's a fun career path. So you worked at CDT, and then we ended up working together in big law at Covington. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your journey from nonprofit, civil society to big law and your experiences at big law.
Sure. I knew nothing about big law going in. My parents aren't lawyers. They don't know any lawyers. I really couldn't tell you the difference between one big firm or another. And when I was going through my law school's OCI, I don't know what they call it here at Duke, but it was their interview process for law firms. I didn't know what I was looking at, and frankly, every firm out there seemed like they had a privacy group. I was kind of skeptical about that, but everybody on their website had a privacy practice, and so I didn't really know quite how to separate them out. I started with an Excel spreadsheet, making notes about my mental impressions and the conversations that I had with people. Still was having a hard time figuring it out. And then eventually I started making notes about stupid things, like, oh, I didn't like the carpet. Because I didn't know what to go on. And then finally it clicked for me to end up at Covington. I had the most fun talking to them. I felt like they were nerding out about these issues like I was, and they were excited to chat about them in their spare time. And I kind of felt that if I were to try out this big law thing, I wanted to do it with people who actually liked what they were doing. And it feels like that's a good starting point. So I just had a feeling that if I were to practice there, I would probably get to just keep learning and growing and being excited about these issues. And just to back up, the reason I went from a nonprofit to a law firm is because, frankly, I wanted the training. I think you can get a lot of different types of training in a variety of different contexts, but for me, being at a law firm was just a way to have the resources, to have people with the expertise right in front of me, and to just learn how to be the best that I can be and get the tools that I need to grow a successful practice from the beginning. So that's why I went the law firm path after doing a nonprofit path for a little while, which was fun too, and they were very encouraging of that at Covington, which was great.
So we'll kind of go through the career journey here. So I know firsthand that you had an incredibly successful career at Covington, but your curiosity took you into the corporate world, first at McKinsey. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about what made you want to try something else, having had a good experience in private practice, and what your role was as an in-house attorney.
Sure. So I actually was having a great time at Covington. I wasn't at all looking to make a move. But one day, though, I got a call from a headhunter who was asking, if I knew anybody who would be interested in this new position that had come up at McKinsey. And she said it is a cybersecurity legal role. You would be on the cyber law team within McKinsey, basically advising the firm on cybersecurity governance and of course, incident response when potential things happen. I immediately said, I don't really know anybody and I'm not interested, thanks. And she called later and asked for my feedback, and I said, well, I wanted to do something where I could continue to work with multiple different clients on different issues rather than just being solely focused on being a legal compliance officer. And she told me that I must have been mistaken about the role, because what she meant was I would be doing legal compliance for the firm while also working with the consultants and analyzing from a legal perspective all the various cyber advisory work that they were doing. So in a way, I got to kind of have my cake and eat it too with that opportunity. And McKinsey also has this mantra called make your own McKinsey, where you can sort of make your career whatever you want it to be. You just have to ask and you have to shape it and you have to find the right mentors and you have to grow it. That just sounded too cool to pass up. So as much fun as I was having at Covington, I decided to try the in-house world. And while I was there, I really got to get a firsthand view of what it was like to not just figure out what the law is and to provide legal advice at an arm's distance, but to problem solve, to take that advice that I'd become used to doing as an associate and working hand in hand with engineers on how to actually implement it, and working hand in hand with the CISO at McKinsey, who is terrific, by the way.
And for the audience, what's a CISO? Not everybody may know.
Yes, sorry, the
CISO
Chief Information Security Officer. So he is basically like the data privacy officer, but for security at a big company like McKinsey.
So just teasing on that a little bit, you mentioned how in your in-house role, and you were wearing a legal hat in-house at McKinsey, you worked very closely with the engineers to solve some of these issues from a company perspective. How important is it, from your vantage point, to be able to work across disciplines?
I feel like it's critical. I think for two reasons. Number one, I think it's good to come in with a solid foundation of the law and what the different trend lines are. But if you don't do the second thing, which is to stop and think and figure out what exactly it means to take that law and operationalize it, I think you're only going halfway. I think with cybersecurity in particular, you're working with a lot of amorphous, ambiguous issues, and nobody really quite knows for sure what they mean. I mean, the standard for cybersecurity in a lot of contexts is reasonableness. You have to have reasonable security mechanisms to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your data. If you just tell that to an engineer, what are they going to do? So you need to learn how to translate those legal, tenets and translate it into actual practices. And once you do that as a lawyer, I feel like your legal advice changes a little bit, and you learn how to anticipate questions, you learn how to advise from a more pragmatic standpoint, and you become more of a partner, more of a problem solver, and I think that just makes you a stronger lawyer, because that's what lawyers are supposed to do. You're supposed to problem solve.
Having spent 30 years in private practice, I completely agree with that. And also, before we jump to your current position, we talked about the role of the lawyer and the importance of being able to communicate clearly with people outside of the legal discipline, with your colleagues in engineering, in other sectors. But in the policy arena, we talked about the cybersecurity laws having a reasonableness standard. We're seeing the AI laws evolve. And how important do you think it is for policymakers to be informed by the engineering and the science as they shape these emerging areas?
It's critical, and I don't see it happening enough, unfortunately. That's not always the case, but I think in general, policymakers start with ideas without actually thinking a little bit further down from the abstract. Probably the most useful class that I took in law school was actually a practicum that was taught by Alvaro Bedoya, who is now a commissioner at the FTC. That class was interesting because the whole idea was that you're here to solve privacy problems. So they would assign you a privacy problem. Mine was about wearables and health privacy. So any privacy, personal data issues from whatever your watch is picking up, or from your sleep app, or from your fertility tracker. And find a way to protect it with the law. So they actually paired us as Georgetown law students with MIT students, and they had the law students go first. They said, okay, here's the problem, learn about it, write a bill, try to solve it, try to protect this data, from a legal perspective. And the groups of law students would go in and they would say, oh, we did such a good job, and we would write this bill. And as soon as the MIT students would take a look at it, they would say, well, you just broke the internet. If you define this in this way, it's going to be too broad. If you require this, it's not technically feasible, so that's not going to do anything. And they would just go down the list of why what we thought was such a cool idea wasn't actually going to work in practice. Honestly, at the time, I didn't realize it, but that was by far the most useful and relevant class that I took, and it's totally relevant to what I do today for Microsoft.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're trying to do at some of the coursework here at Duke, like for example, the ethical tech practicum class that I teach, and there are other classes here at Duke as well, bringing together the students from different schools across campus, engineers, tech ethics students, public policy students, law students, and working collaboratively on real world problems, because it really does take a village to solve some of these issues, and I agree as well, and it's hard, right? Like, most people don't understand what federated learning is, or don't understand the details of privacy enhancing technology. So if a policymaker doesn't understand that, it doesn't mean that they're not really smart and capable, but we all need to learn from each other, and creating that ecosystem where people can continue to learn collaboratively. I think all ships rise together.
Right.
So now, yeah, I know you had a stellar career at McKinsey, and it was a great job, but you decided to try something new, and now you are kind of front and center on privacy at Microsoft. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that transition?
Sure. So that was another one where the opportunity kind of presented itself. So harkening back to what you said before, it's putting yourself out there and meeting people and networking. You really never know what could come your way later on down the road when you do that. It may feel like you're not doing much, but you're actually really investing in a potential future opportunity. This is another one of those cases where I was at McKinsey, I was learning a lot, I was soaking it in, I was happy, and then one of my former bosses from CDT decided to switch over from CDT and go to Microsoft. And I thought that transition was interesting, and I too had done the nonprofit to private sector transition, so I thought it was COVID, so I said, let's grab virtual coffee. I'd love to hear about how it's going. I've always been a big fan of Microsoft and admired everything that they did. And so we caught up, and then later he emailed me and said, hey, it's too bad you just made the move to McKinsey because my team's hiring, so if you know anybody, let me know. And I looked at the job description, and I saw that it was going to sit on Julie Brill's team. and Julie Brill is another former FTC commissioner. She is a giant in the world of privacy. She's incredible. So I thought that the opportunity seemed really, really neat. And the opportunity was kind of twofold. It was, number one, from an advocacy, external-facing standpoint, work with Microsoft to help figure out how the company feels about various privacy legislative issues and try to advocate for its positions on those issues, while internally continuing work with business teams and frontline attorneys, the people who work directly with engineers, and help the business sort of see around corners and understand where these trend lines are going. I really loved that twofold hat, and the team itself sounded terrific, and I loved working with my boss, Chris, at CDT. So I just threw my hat in the ring, and I said, I'm in. I'd love to be considered. And so I went through the whole process. I ended up getting the job, and I've been there for a year and a half now.
So now let's talk privacy, which is probably one of the fastest moving areas of law, and we've got the GDPR in Europe, And in the US, we do not have federal privacy legislation that's generally applicable, and we have a patchwork of state regulations that seem to be popping up, almost a new one every day. From your vantage point, given this quickly evolving landscape, what do you see as some of the pressing issues that privacy professionals ought to be thinking about?
Well, there are a lot of them. I think the three that I'm working on most consistently right now are number one, trying to balance the internet ecosystem, which runs largely on ads, with privacy. I think another issue that is keeping me busy lately is kids' privacy. You know, as the youngest and the most vulnerable members of society, surely we can focus the most on protecting them. At the same time, though, there are a lot of different trade-offs when it comes to children online, because my team focuses on privacy, but we have a lot of other people focusing on kids' safety too. And sometimes those issues don't match. So we've been working with that. And then the third issue I would say is data flows. A lot of countries are starting to talk about data sovereignty and where data should reside and how data should be protected and whether it's possible to protect it if it gets sent outside of borders. I think that that's going to be an issue that is long-standing, and it's going to continue. I'd say, yeah, those are the three that are keeping me busy.
Those are three big issues. So let's probe each of those, because I think one of the points that you raise is a lot of times goals that we have can be in tension or in conflict with each other. Like coming back to the first point that you mentioned with the internet ecosystem, that we want it to be freely available, and part of making it freely available is being able to access services where people don't have to pay, which helps close the digital divide. The trade-off there is on the privacy side, when the platforms need to support themselves, so they engage in targeted advertising to generate revenue. Maybe share your thoughts, like on how would you balance the ecosystem and try to achieve both of those goals, protecting the privacy but also making it freely accessible?
So I think that that's one of the tougher issues, and it's an issue that no one really wants to talk about because they know that there are no perfect answers. You know, I think on the one hand, the internet being open, innovative, and free largely does lend itself to targeted ads. It does. I think on the other hand, though, the monetization of data, if you don't have proper data governance and proper protections from a legal perspective, can lead to tremendous consequences. So it's an incredibly tough balance, and you have to think about trade-offs. You have to think about whether maybe reverting from an advertising model to a subscription model could lead to information asymmetry. Maybe that way we could end up in a place where if you want to, you can pay for more privacy, but then you end up with some people who are too poor for privacy. I mean, that just doesn't seem right from an ethical perspective. In terms of how you strike that balance, I think putting it back in the hands of the consumer is never a bad thing, in my view. I think making sure that people can have the right understanding of what is happening with their data and the right valid choice with respect to how it is used really is a way to help with those consumers who really don't mind targeted advertising, don't mind having their data shared, don't mind that more customized, personalized experience that you get when you do that, while also catering to the needs of those people who really don't feel comfortable with that, or maybe do feel comfortable with that, but not with respect to this kind of data. I think just control and transparency is key with this issue, at least until we find a way to solve it in a perfectly privacy protective way, which if any of you figure that out, please let me know.
But isn't that hard to do? I mean, I'm guilty of it, that I go on a website and I see, will you accept cookies? And I click yes, so I'm consenting. But do I really understand as a consumer what I'm consenting to?
Right.
I know some of the states, like in California and Colorado, are trying to be more proactive in terms of making sure that that consent is more informed. But what are your thoughts in terms of how to really empower the consumer in a way that's meaningful?
It's been really interesting watching regulators figure this out. I think long before we had any state privacy laws, the FTC had been talking about this for some time. The FTC had been talking about what makes for a good privacy policy, why there needs to be a good privacy policy. And that's really what we had to start off with, these lengthy privacy policies with some iterations from regulators here and there on how to make them more accessible and how to make them understandable. Now in California and Colorado, we see two states that have enacted comprehensive privacy laws, and the regulators are working on filling in the blanks with those laws through regulation. And those regulations have details in them that are fascinating at this point, because they're delving into issues about what's a dark pattern, and when you describe something in a certain way, are you intentionally or not leading the consumer to make a choice that they really don't actually want to make. They provide really extensive guidelines on how to make sure that information is presented in a not terms of service lengthy agreement type of thing, but in an accessible, contextual way to help people understand it. And I think that that's the right approach, because at the end of the day, companies have different interfaces with users, companies have different products, companies have different types of information and levels of criticality of that information that they're trying to convey. So regulators putting out guidance points like that and descriptions of what is required rather than prescriptive rules is probably the right way to go about things, because companies need to figure out for themselves how is the best way to present what the consumer needs to know based on my interface. It could be a smartwatch for one company, and it could be a website for another one. You're just going to have to do that on a case-by-case basis with guidelines and outcome-based rules.
And that's probably another example where having engineers talk with regulators would be really helpful. How do you actually come up with systems to create this informed consent? And from the legal standpoint, one of the things I heard you refer to was providing guidance. So that would not necessarily be a binding rule,
right?
But using, from a legal standpoint, a soft law mechanism to put the guidance out there to guide companies, which can be updated a little bit more nimbly than if you actually have something codified in regulation.
Yeah, no, and I think that there are two regulators that stand out in my mind, and not to single anybody out at the exclusion of others, but two that stand out in my mind that put out great guidance. Number one, the FTC. If you're interested in these issues, please check out the FTC's business blog and their consumer blog and their reports that they put out. I think the FTC's privacy report came out in 2014, something along those lines, but it's almost a decade old. It's still very valid, and it's actually incredible when you read it and you consider the fact that they came up with this 10 years ago. The other regulator, which is a particularly fun one to watch because it's in a newer space right now, but it's the UK Information Commissioner's Office. They put out an incredible amount of guidelines and videos and really great resources for companies and for consumers to figure out what these laws mean and what it actually means to comply, because on paper sometimes these laws can be really ambiguous.
And then I think a lot of times those guidance documents, when they are not binding law, you come back to some of the descriptions of the laws that you said, where the law just says do what is reasonable, that they can become in some ways like almost a de facto standard, something that a judge might look at potentially to assess whether or not a company has been reasonable.
Right.
Have they looked at that guidance document? Have they made efforts to comply? Or if they haven't followed it, is there a good reason for taking a different approach? We could talk about that all day, but quickly, just maybe give us a little deeper description on what are some of the tensions around children's privacy, something that President Biden called out in the Wall Street Journal a couple weeks ago as one of his top concerns.
Well, and in his State of the Union previously, that's been an issue that everyone has been wrestling with. I think the issue with kids' privacy is, it's interesting because on the one hand, you want to protect their data first and foremost. Data that belongs to a child under a lot of existing law is automatically considered sensitive data, which means it's subject to heightened protections. That's great, and from a privacy standpoint, I think that makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, from a safety standpoint, you almost need to depending on the requirement, you might need to collect more data from the child in order to apply the appropriate safety protections.
And certainly with, the proliferation of smart toys, educational tools that are directed towards children, the metaverse, ChatGPT, these issues are going to be generally accessible, which just really puts even a greater premium on trying to figure out some of these solutions and balancing those tensions to protect children, which I think we all agree we need to do. Maybe we'll open up for questions in a minute, but you also touched upon the cross-border data flow issue, which if anybody's been following the saga between the EU and the US, which it looks like we're on a path to getting resolved, they can also be really tough issues because individual countries, pursuant to their norms, adopt privacy laws, and there's a lot of concerns of a jurisdiction of allowing that personal data to flow to a country where you may not have comparable data protections. So it's a real issue because we do, even within the United States, we have a patchwork of privacy laws, but then you look at it internationally and you call it a quilt, I call it a patchwork, but it just multiplies. So maybe kind of share with us some of the most pressing issues on the cross-border data flow and data sovereignty.
Well, two things have kind of stood out to me as interesting. I think number one, from a technical perspective, this has been one of those issues where drawing in people with the technical expertise has been really important because you have to understand internet infrastructure, why it is so difficult to keep the internet in a certain jurisdictional box and not let data go out from that box to another box. And helping regulators understand that there are ways to protect data that don't involve keeping it in one specific set location. In fact, potentially better ways. I personally am of the mindset that data protections are more about the protections that you apply to the data itself rather than where it is stored. Those protections should follow it wherever it goes. But the second thing that's interesting to me about data flows is that everyone has a different answer. And I think that overall we saw Europe and GDPR and the Schrems II decision interpreting GDPR come up with certain solutions, like you can transfer between two countries that are deemed to be adequate. So if the recipient country has substantially similar laws in place to protect the data as the country sending the data, you're good. Or you can have a contract between the entities sending the data where they agree on how to protect the data no matter where it's going. But then you have other countries doing something different. India right now stands out to me. Right now their latest privacy bill proposes to create a whitelist of countries that are good. So it's kind of like adequacy, but it's a set list of these are the types of countries that we will allow to receive data going out of India. And then you have other countries that are coming up with their own lists of countries that they are comfortable with sharing data with. So you can imagine this weird world where you're going to have a bunch of different rules of the road depending on where the data is coming from and where it is going. And then a country that might be good for one country may not be good for another one. So it's interesting because this patchwork or quilt, what you will, is actually playing out in real time, and it's playing out in terms of infrastructure and how the internet is actually built on the ground, which is just fascinating.
Which is also an interesting lesson for the engineers and people on the business side, that as you're planning your networks and your system and your infrastructure and your data flows, you need to talk to the lawyers. Right. Because where you put those servers and how you structure those data flows could have real consequence in terms of whether you're able to implement your business plans because of all the laws. Because one thing everybody wants to make sure they do, as I always say to my students, is complying with the law is the baseline. You always want to make sure that you comply with the law. And a lot of times there are really good reasons to go above what the laws require. So it just kind of brings back to something that we've all talked about, but the privacy, the ethics, the compliance by design of thinking about these issues up front and building it into the design and making those tough trade-off issues. So I've been asking Jadzia a lot of questions, and I know she'd love to hear from you. Who's going to ask the first question? Go ahead.
So we talked a lot about data control, and one issue is different loopholes for data localization, like maybe the EU can send something to Or even domestically, maybe Microsoft sells to a data broker who then turns around and sells to someone else, right? So is this idea of tracing data, is that a fool's errand? Is that something that is feasible? And is it more about the actual collection point, or is that possible to trace a network of knowing where your data is at all times?
Yeah, it's funny, I'm not sure that data tracking in perpetuity is going to be the answer. In fact, that could lead to more privacy harms, because when you think about it, if you have to perpetually track where data goes, that's almost like a map of a person's activity. I think it's more about accountability. It's more about assigning accountability to the data controller that has that data in the first place, making sure that the onus is on them to make sure that the data continues to be protected no matter where it goes. It sounds like a shortcut answer, but I think from a legal perspective, it actually makes a lot of sense. To your point though, having data get pushed on and moved to different types of jurisdictions actually shows why data is becoming not just a privacy issue, but a trade issue. And I feel like that's fascinating because we've always known that data is going to be a privacy issue. We've accepted that data is a cybersecurity issue. But now we're talking international trade, and we're talking all these different considerations that have to go into play as you move data to different locations all over the world. So I feel like rather than tracking, I think accountability is going to have to be where it's at from all of those different legal perspectives.
Which also brings up another interesting point, that even when you're practicing law in a big law firm or in a corporation, so many, even within the legal field, so many of these issues require a multidisciplinary approach. So if you're the privacy lawyer, you're a transaction lawyer, you may not be the trade expert, and it's okay not to be an expert in everything, but to know when to call your colleague who is the trade expert and get that advice. And also I think kind of on the data localization issues, you know, looking at the role of multilateral organizations, like for example, maybe you could talk a little bit about the OECD and what it's been trying to do to try to harmonize on some of these issues.
Yeah, so that's been a really interesting effort. I mean, I think that a lot of people, whether it's the OECD or even the G7 or the G20, everybody is trying to come up with its own solution for what shared understanding of practices we can all commit to safely transfer data all over the world, but in a more seamless way. I think that that's always going to be a struggle, but it's a worthy endeavor because at the end of the day, we all may have different ideas with respect to what the rules of the road should be and how we can keep people accountable for those rules of the road once they sign up for them. But unless we have that shared understanding and unless we have these efforts like what the OECD is doing, we're going to remain at this impasse where you're essentially playing whack-a-mole, where all these different countries are going to decide to do their own thing, and at a moment's notice it can change, and then you can shut everything down from an operations standpoint. I feel like that cross-collaboration is just going to have to be the answer. I don't know exactly what it'll look like.
But it underscores, you know, the important role that some of these multilateral organizations can play in trying to solve some of these issues on a global level.
Get people to the table.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great question. Who's got
Really
the
good
next question? Go ahead.
I'm not sure if you can comment on that, but considering the threats that AI might impose into privacy, is your opinion, for example, that might be better to have a self-regulatory approach on this industry, or maybe to have laws like ahead to control the development of AI?
I think all the above, honestly. I think it's going to be really, really hard for laws to predict every potential problem that could possibly happen. I think that any law that goes on the books is going to be out of date tomorrow if it's not crafted correctly. I think we're going to need a combination of self-governance. I do think that we will need laws to just give companies a little bit of predictability and rules of the road. But I think the key is going to be structure, and the key is going to be making sure that we don't err on the side of prescriptive rules at a time when we're still trying to figure out what this technology is, and err on the side instead of being more like cybersecurity, sort of outcomes focused, and giving companies the tools and the resources and the guidance they need to figure out how best to achieve those outcomes. So I really do. I think we're going to need both. And it looks like we're seeing both develop in real time, which is really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, what you said is very similar to what EEOC Commissioner Keith Sonderling said here last week. And then if you look at what the government is doing, just last week, the NIST, which is part of the Commerce Department, released the final version of the AI risk management framework. And that really is all about, how do companies internally manage the risk with respect to AI, which inevitably touches on privacy because the data is a big part of that. But that is not necessarily in lieu of passing rules and regulations or enforcing, as we talked about last week, existing laws with respect to the new technologies. And the FTC has been pretty aggressive with enforcing Section 5 of the Federal Trade Act that prohibits unfair, deceptive trade practices against new technologies. So, I think the self-regulation and the management is an important piece that will be married up with either the new laws or applying existing laws to the new technologies. But also kind of building off of that, bringing it to the by design standpoint of trying to get those inputs and that feedback on what what would be best for a child up front, so you can factor that into the product design and not be considering it as an afterthought as the product's getting ready to launch.
It's funny too, because you're starting to see regulators struggle with this as well. I don't know if you guys have been following the California regulators' rulemaking efforts, but part of the law says that they need to put in place like a good button that would help people understand that that's the button that they click to opt out or to exercise other privacy choices. The button's not clear at all. and as part of their consultation process, they put out like this proposed design, and multiple people commented on why it's not clear and why users could be mistaken about this. And so it's really funny because even the experts and even the regulators are struggling with how to best convey to people, what they can do to control their data. And it's a whole lot of trial and error. And if you start thinking about this issue as a consumer, you'll find yourself looking at what you're seeing online in a totally different way. There are so many instances now that I've read the FTC's report on dark patterns, and now that I've read all these other regulations that are trying to stamp out dark patterns, where I'll be scrolling through and I'll be asked for my data and I'll be like, well, that's a dark pattern.
So what are not everybody in the room may not know what a dark pattern is.
So a dark pattern is basically like a way to design a user interface that motivates consumers to make a choice that they wouldn't otherwise make. So one example that I've heard, I think everybody's definition of dark patterns is different, but one example that someone has given is, if you're being asked to subscribe on a permanent basis, and there's a big button in front of you that says, yes, subscribe me, and then a tiny little one that says, no thanks, I just want to read this article. That could be considered a dark pattern. Another one that was kicked around during the California rulemaking, which I don't know if it was adopted yet, but it kind of made me chuckle. But naming and shaming, where sometimes you're on a website and they say, click this button to share all your data, and we'll give you everything for free. And then a small button that says, no thanks, I don't want free anything. And it makes you a consumer feel stupid, but what you really want is to just access something and not share all your data. So things like that make you inclined to do things that you otherwise wouldn't do. The definition's evolving, though. That's another one of those ambiguous examples where everyone thinks differently.
And the rules are evolving too, because wasn't this one of the issues that's on the radar screen of the FTC with its advance notice of proposed rulemaking? Very much so,
yeah. And the FTC did put out a great report on its views on dark patterns and all of its research, and they had plenty of academics and scientists and other people working with them on what makes people click this button versus that one. I honestly think that you can make a career out of it at this point. Yeah, it's evolving.
So who's got the next computer?
Firstly, thanks for coming and speaking with us today. I was curious, from your perspective and the perspective of a global company like Microsoft, we hear a lot about in the privacy world of the Brussels effect. And I was wondering how easy, or I imagine how difficult it is for a company like Microsoft to maybe take advantage of, in certain ways, jurisdictions that have more lax privacy policies versus just keeping up as a business reality. The fact that the EU has a big effect. There's a lot of consumers in that jurisdiction. How much is it a matter of just kind of following what the Europeans are doing versus actually Microsoft being able to segment its business practices across different jurisdictions?
I'm really glad you're asking this question because now I can call attention to Brad Smith's book. It's called Tools and Weapons. If you haven't read it yet, please check it out. If you want a good look at what it is actually like to deal with these really hard issues as a company like Microsoft, this book takes you through the SolarWinds crisis. This book takes you through sustainability. It takes you through GDPR. And the GDPR chapter is really what describes, I think, what a lot of companies went through, which is looking at the GDPR, momentary panic because not really knowing what to do with it or how to comply, and no one's ever really had to do this before. And then realizing that once you figured it out, it's just easier from a technical perspective to do that for everybody. So I think that Microsoft was actually the first company to commit to just give the core rights of the GDPR to everyone. And the chapter on GDPR is fascinating because it shows conversations between Brad Smith, our chief legal officer, Satya Nadella, and others on figuring out, okay, now that we've figured out this piece of the puzzle for this jurisdiction, what do we do? And they apparently, according to the chapter, had a great conversation with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who was saying, Canada's looking to do something very similar. We want a privacy law. And apparently there was a little bit of shock there because while everyone was freaking out about the GDPR and saying it was going to stifle innovation, all of a sudden Microsoft was saying you should do the GDPR because we've already solved for that. And I think at the end of the day, the internet is borderless. You can try to create borders and you can try to segment your networks as best you can. But at the end of the day, it's really most helpful to be harmonized. Now that the GDPR set a standard, it is definitely possible to do something stronger and to keep improving on it. But at the end of the day, I think the concepts are there.
Listening to what you're saying, it kind of shows how the issues tie together, because if we had harmonized laws, then we might have less difficulty navigating some of the cross-border issues and the data sovereignty issues, because then one jurisdiction would have more comfort that the data of their citizens would be safe if it was exported to another issue, which might solve some of the trade issues. Anybody else have a question? Nora?
I'm interested in hearing more about children's privacy policy pertaining to age. I'm thinking about in medical decision making, an older kid can't provide consent, but they can assent, and that ought to be considered. How do you think about creating privacy policies for different ages, especially as we see really, really young kids using the internet, and then of course teenagers using the internet in very different ways?
It's a great question, and I think slowly but surely regulators are recognizing the fact that rules for a 6-year-old are not the same as rules for a 16-year-old. and I think number one, taking a risk-based approach is key, not just with respect to the product that you're using. The risks of Microsoft Word are probably different than the risks of Xbox, but also taking into account the different risks of the various age groups that are using your platform. I think as children become older and a little bit more sophisticated, they should perhaps have a little bit more privacy and autonomy online. At the same time, you have to balance that with enabling and encouraging parents to parent. These are all really hard issues, but I think if you're thinking about different age groups and weighing the different risks and applying rules based on those risk considerations, then you're on your way. I have yet to see a law do that perfectly.
And I think one of the themes I'm hearing too, which again is inherently multidisciplinary, is the risk assessment and the risk management, because a lot of the decisions are informed by the risk levels. What are you trying to prevent? And you've got to understand what they are and getting the input from all the different stakeholders. I think we have one more hand up, one more question.
So you talked a little bit about the patchwork nature of privacy laws right now.
Yeah.
It seems kind of similar to me to U.S. drinking age in the 1980s and stuff, where it's very patchwork state to state, and you had the federal government come in and say this is what the drinking age should be. Do you think it's possible or likely for something like that to happen with data privacy, where there's an overarching force that comes in and says this is what data privacy needs to be?
I hope so. Microsoft's been calling for a federal level privacy law since 2005, I think. I guess it's a good thing they didn't hold their breath because it still hadn't happened yet. But no, I think at a minimum, every American deserves some protection over their data. And there just doesn't seem to be something quite right about the notion that, you know, if you're in California, then you get all these protections, and if you're in a state without a law, you don't have any. I really hope that we can at least get a baseline level of protections for everybody so that, you know, number one, consumers can be protected across the board. But number two, companies can know what to do rather than having to compare apples to oranges as all these different states figure out what they want privacy to look like.
We'll see if 2023 brings
That's our year.
privacy legislation. They got close last year.
Very close.
But that's great. Well, wow, that hour flew by. Jadzia, thank you so much for making the trip down here to Duke.